In Washington's marble halls, silence can be more dangerous than war. One freshman lawmaker dared to speak and shook the entire Senate. When Jasmine Crockett clashed with Elizabeth Warren, what began as a debate turned into a battle for the Constitution itself. Allies rose, enemies plotted, and the old order began to tremble. This is not just politics. This is the story of a rising force that Washington could not ignore. The Senate chamber was heavy with tension, the kind that clung to the air like static before a thunderstorm. Rows of senators leaned back in their leather chairs, staffers scribbled notes in hurried silence, and reporters poised over keyboards, waiting for the smallest slip, the faintest spark, to ignite a headline. This was supposed to be routine, another committee hearing where a Yale professor of constitutional law would deliver polished, academic arguments and lawmakers would either nod along or spar half-heartedly for sound bites. Nothing here was meant to surprise. Nothing here was meant to change history. Yet, on this day, the script began to tear apart. Representative Jasmine Crockett, a freshman congresswoman from Texas, leaned forward in her chair with a steady, almost surgical calm. She was not supposed to dominate the room. She was not supposed to overshadow scholars with decades of acclaim. Yet every word she spoke cut through the chamber like glass. Her tone was measured, her cadence unhurried, but her argument was devastating. She had taken apart the Yale professor's testimony piece by piece, exposing contradictions, unraveling assumptions, and laying out a constitutional analysis so clean, so precise, it seemed impossible she was only in her first term. At first, the silence was subtle. A few senators glanced sideways, brows tightening. Staffers looked up from their notes. The Yale professor shifted in his seat, the faintest frown tightening his lips as Crockett dismantled the very foundation of his argument. By the time she concluded, the silence was total, an unspoken acknowledgement that something unusual, something rare, had just occurred. A freshman representative had not only held her ground against an Ivy League scholar, she had eclipsed him. For a heartbeat, no one moved. No one spoke. It was as though the room itself refused to breathe. And then, the stillness shattered. Elizabeth Warren raised her hand. The interruption was subtle, almost polite, but its impact was seismic. The chairman of the committee, halfway through adjusting his microphone, froze. Senators craned their necks. Reporters stopped typing mid-sentence. Elizabeth Warren did not raise her hand lightly. A former Harvard law professor. A presidential candidate. A senator with a reputation for intellectual firepower and relentless interrogation. When Warren spoke, people listened. And when Warren interrupted, people understood something extraordinary was unfolding. "Mr. Chairman," she said, her voice calm yet edged with urgency, "I must respond to what we've just witnessed." All eyes locked on her. Warren removed her glasses slowly, as if deliberately stretching the moment. She turned, not to the chairman, not to the Yale professor, but directly toward Jasmine Crockett. The effect was electric. Crockett, still seated, met Warren's gaze with quiet steadiness. Around them, the chamber vibrated with unspoken questions. What was Warren about to say? Would she correct the freshman? Challenge her? Put her in her place? The expectation was clear. Warren was the intellectual titan of the Senate. Crockett was a rising figure, yes, but still untested in the brutal arena of constitutional scholarship at the highest level. Surely Warren would reclaim the room for the veterans, for the established voices. But then Warren spoke. "In my decades of teaching constitutional law at Harvard," she began, her tone slow, deliberate, every word carrying the gravity of her authority, "I have never heard such a remarkable and clear-eyed analysis of executive power as what Representative Crockett just delivered here today." A shockwave ripped through the room. Gasps broke the silence. Camera shutters snapped furiously, capturing the exact moment Warren, the professor-senator, the scourge of Wall Street and corporate giants, declared the words no one had expected: praise. Not correction, not dismissal. Praise. Even a senior Republican senator, known for his poker-faced demeanor, leaned forward with raised brows, his lips parting in surprise. Staffers whispered urgently to one another. Reporters fumbled to capture Warren's words verbatim, knowing instinctively that history was being written in real time. And Warren was not finished. This isn't just good analysis, she continued, her voice gaining strength, echoing through the chamber. This is constitutional interpretation at its finest. What we've heard today is not the voice of a freshman testing her footing. What we've heard is the kind of clarity and brilliance that will shape how executive authority is understood for years, perhaps for generations. The Yale professor's face darkened. He adjusted his papers, his confidence visibly shaken. For him, the debate was over. For Jasmine Crockett, the story was just beginning. The chamber erupted into applause. It wasn't the polite, perfunctory clapping that usually followed committee exchanges. It was louder, sharper, an almost rebellious outburst in a space defined by rigid decorum. Senators leaned back, some clapping earnestly, others reluctantly. The moment had cracked open something deeper than the issue at hand. A generational shift. A transfer of legitimacy. Elizabeth Warren, the veteran, the intellectual force, had just declared Jasmine Crockett her equal. And Washington, a city addicted to hierarchy and seniority, was struggling to process it. The sound of applause still echoed faintly in the chamber, but the atmosphere had shifted into something far more dangerous than celebration. Elizabeth Warren had not only praised Jasmine Crockett, she had changed the rules of the game. In Washington, praise was never free. Praise was currency, leverage, strategy. And when it came from Warren, it was a declaration. The Yale professor sat stiffly, his hands tightening on his notes as though trying to hold on to whatever remained of his credibility. His arguments, once so polished, so bulletproof in academic circles, were now scattered debris in the wake of Crockett's relentless dismantling. And Warren had just made it clear that Crockett's reasoning was not an anomaly. It was the new standard. Representative Crockett, Warren said, turning fully to face her, your framing of executive authority has revealed something I fear too many of us have overlooked. Her tone carried no condescension, no seniority disguised as kindness. Instead, it was measured, respectful, a senator speaking to a peer. The weight of that recognition sank heavily on the room. Crockett sat in silence, her expression steady, betraying none of the adrenaline surely coursing beneath her calm exterior. She had entered this chamber a freshman, one voice among many, untested and underestimated. Now Warren's words pulled her into a spotlight she had not asked for, but could no longer avoid. Reporters typed furiously, headlines already forming in their minds. Warren endorses Crockett's constitutional vision. Generational shift in real time. The chamber, once frozen in disbelief, was now buzzing with restless energy. Staffers whispered into phones. Senators leaned toward each other, gauging reactions, weighing alliances. But Warren wasn't finished. Too often, she said, adjusting the microphone with deliberate slowness, we treat constitutional interpretation as an abstract exercise, disconnected from the people it serves. Representative Crockett reminds us that the Constitution lives not in theory, but in practice. When an overreach of power threatens ordinary citizens, when the law becomes a shield for the powerful instead of the powerless. That's when clarity matters. That's when voices like hers matter. The Yale professor cleared his throat, attempting to recover ground. Senator Warren, with respect, he began, his tone sharpened by bruised pride. But Warren didn't even turn toward him. Her gaze remained locked on Crockett. The dismissal was subtle, almost invisible, yet unmistakable. For a scholar who had built his career on prestige and pedigree, it was a public humiliation. He wasn't just being challenged, he was being erased. Crockett shifted slightly in her chair. Though her lips remained pressed into a polite line, her eyes betrayed a flicker of something more complex, awareness. She knew what this meant. Warren's endorsement was no small compliment. It was a burden, a mantle, and a warning. Praise this public could not be taken back. And once given, it demanded that she live up to it. The chairman cleared his throat, attempting to wrest control of the hearing back. Thank you, Senator Warren. We must move forward with. But Warren leaned closer to the microphone, cutting him off again. Her voice was calm, but her interruption was sharper this time, slicing through the chairman's attempt like a knife. Mr. Chairman, with due respect, what just happened here deserves more than a procedural note and a polite transition. It deserves recognition. And it deserves debate. The room stilled once more. Debate. The word rang out like a challenge. This wasn't going to be a fleeting compliment, a single line in a transcript. Warren was proposing something bolder, to engage Crockett directly, to place her analysis on equal footing with hers, to turn this freshman into her intellectual sparring partner before the eyes of the nation. Reporters nearly fell over themselves, the rapid-fire clatter of keyboards echoing through the chamber. Senators exchanged wary glances. Some leaned back, intrigued. Others frowned, already calculating what this would mean for committee hierarchies and media narratives. Elizabeth Warren had just elevated Jasmine Crockett into the arena, and she had done it in the most public, irreversible way possible. For Crockett, the silence of the chamber had been victory enough. But now, with Warren's challenge hanging in the air, she realized the silence had only been the beginning. The silence that followed Warren's challenge was suffocating. It wasn't the ordinary pause of a committee session. It was the kind of silence that came when everyone in the room realized the rules had just been rewritten. Senators who had been half distracted now leaned forward, their pens still in hand but motionless. The cameras zoomed tighter, the reporters typing as if they were trying to etch history into their keyboards before it slipped away. Jasmine Crockett adjusted her microphone with deliberate calm. Inside, her mind was sharp, calculating the battlefield she had just been thrust into. She hadn't asked for Warren's challenge, but she understood immediately what it meant. This was no longer about a Yale professor's testimony or the limits of executive power. This was about proving she could stand toe-to-toe with one of the most formidable legal minds in America. Elizabeth Warren leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "Representative Crockett," she began, her voice smooth, edged with steel, "your analysis of Justice Jackson's framework is precise. But I want to test its boundaries. Suppose a president claims emergency authority not because of war or imminent threat, but because of systemic economic collapse. Where do you place that in Jackson's tears? Is it inherent power, or does it collapse into congressional necessity?" The question was surgical, designed to cut deep. Senators in the room recognized the tactic instantly. Warren was doing what she had done to banking CEOs, to cabinet nominees, to anyone who dared underestimate her. She was pushing beyond theory into the realm of traps and contradictions. But Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned slightly closer to her microphone, her voice steady but firm. "Senator, economic collapse, while urgent, does not inherently grant the president unilateral power. If we follow Jackson faithfully, such action falls into the second category, a twilight zone where Congress must assert its authority. Otherwise, the precedent we create is dangerous. Any president could declare an economic emergency whenever politically convenient, bypassing legislative oversight entirely. That's not just unconstitutional, it's authoritarian." The words landed hard. There was no stammer, no hesitation. Crockett had not only answered Warren's test, she had expanded it, reframing the question as a warning against executive overreach. Warren's lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but into something rarer, acknowledgement. She adjusted her glasses and pressed further. "But consider this, Congresswoman. What if Congress itself is paralyzed? What if partisanship prevents any legislative response? Should the executive do nothing as the nation burns?" This was the trap. The kind of question designed to corner, to force an answer that could later be twisted into political attack lines. The Yale professor had once written an entire law review article on this scenario. He sat forward, eager to see Crockett stumble. But Crockett's answer came quickly, with the crispness of someone who had lived through real legal crises, not just written about them. "Senator, paralysis in Congress is not a constitutional loophole. The framers did not design Article 2 as a failsafe for political dysfunction. They designed checks and balances to withstand dysfunction. If Congress fails, the answer isn't unilateral action, it's accountability to the people. Otherwise, we normalize executive supremacy under the excuse of legislative gridlock." The room erupted with murmurs. Staffers whispered, reporters typed faster, and several senators glanced at one another with wide-eyed recognition. This wasn't a freshman reciting case law, this was a constitutional strike, delivered with the precision of someone who had defended powerless clients against overwhelming authority in real courtrooms. Warren exhaled slowly, her expression shifting. The duel was no longer about testing Crockett. It was becoming something else entirely, an intellectual dialogue between equals. She nodded, her voice measured. That, Representative, is the nuance even seasoned colleagues often miss. The Yale professor's face had turned pale. His carefully rehearsed testimony now felt irrelevant. He opened his mouth to interject, desperate to reclaim control. But Warren silenced him with a glance so sharp it cut him out of the conversation entirely. For the first time, he was the outsider, reduced to a spectator. And then it happened. Warren leaned in again, lowering her voice slightly, though every microphone captured her words. You realize, Representative Crockett, that by this logic, you're not just questioning executive power. You're questioning the very way Congress has allowed itself to surrender authority over decades. The room froze. Senators shifted uncomfortably. She wasn't wrong. Crockett's logic didn't just rebuke presidents, it rebuked Congress itself. If taken seriously, her argument exposed decades of negligence, complicity, and political cowardice. And now, Warren had placed that responsibility directly in her hands. The chamber had gone deathly still. Elizabeth Warren's words still lingered like smoke in the air, thick and heavy, impossible to ignore. You're questioning the very way Congress has surrendered authority. That was no casual remark, it was a live grenade Warren had placed in Jasmine Crockett's lap. One wrong move, and it could blow her credibility apart. Every eye in the room fixed on Crockett. Some senators leaned back, arms crossed, silently daring her to retreat. Others leaned forward, intrigued, as though sensing that what she said next might mark the arrival of a new voice powerful enough to change the balance of Washington itself. Reporters' fingers hovered above their keyboards, waiting to either document her rise or her collapse. Crockett inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She had built her career in crowded courtrooms where hostile judges, skeptical juries, and overwhelming odds were the norm. This chamber, though intimidating, was just another courtroom, only the stakes were higher. She met Warren's gaze, her voice calm, unwavering. Senator, with respect, Crockett began, her words deliberate, Congress hasn't simply surrendered authority, it has neglected its duty. Over decades, both parties have allowed presidents to stretch the boundaries of Article 2. Instead of defending our role as the legislative branch, we've often looked the other way, especially when it served short-term political goals. A low murmur spread across the room. Senior lawmakers shifted uneasily in their seats, some bristling at the bluntness, others nodding reluctantly at the truth. Crockett pressed forward, her tone sharpening, each word a precise strike. That failure has consequences, she continued. The American people don't just lose faith in the presidency when power is abused, they lose faith in Congress for failing to stop it. If we are unwilling to defend the separation of powers, then we are complicit in their erosion. And that betrayal of duty undermines the very democracy we swore to protect. It was an audacious statement, and the silence that followed carried a dangerous edge. For a freshman lawmaker to publicly indict Congress itself, in front of senior senators, was almost unheard of. Yet Crockett's delivery was so measured, so rooted in constitutional principle, that it landed not as recklessness but as clarity. Elizabeth Warren leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing, not in disapproval, but in careful calculation. She had thrown down the gauntlet, and Crockett had not only picked it up, she had hurled it back across the chamber, straight at the institution itself. The Yale professor, desperate to re-enter the debate, adjusted his papers and blurted, "With all due respect, Representative, such rhetoric ignores the practical necessity of executive flexibility." But before he could continue, Warren cut him off coldly. "Professor, forgive me, but what Representative Crockett just laid out is not rhetoric. It is constitutional accountability, something this committee has conveniently sidestepped for years." Her voice cracked like a whip. The professor recoiled, humiliated, his authority shattered once again. The chairman rubbed his temples, aware that control of the hearing was slipping through his fingers. "Representative Crockett," he began carefully, "these are serious accusations. Do you mean to suggest Congress itself has?" Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned into her microphone, her voice cutting through the tension with precise force. "Yes, Mr. Chairman. That's exactly what I mean. This body has failed to defend the balance of power. And if we refuse to admit it, then every constitutional debate we hold here is nothing more than theatre. The words landed like a hammer. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Reporters typed furiously, their headlines already writing themselves. Freshman representative blasts Congress for abdicating constitutional duty. Senior senators glanced nervously at one another, calculating the political fallout. And then, something remarkable happened. Elizabeth Warren's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, rare and fleeting, but unmistakable. She adjusted her glasses, leaned into her microphone, and said with a voice low but firm enough for every camera to capture, "Mr. Chairman, I believe Representative Crockett is right." The chamber erupted. The Senate chamber erupted into chaos the moment Warren's words hit the air. Staffers whispered frantically, senators huddled into sudden clusters, and reporters practically leapt from their seats, desperate to transmit what had just happened. A freshman representative had confronted Congress itself, and a senior senator, one of the most respected progressive minds in the nation, had agreed with her. It was no longer just a debate. It was an earthquake. Within minutes, cable news networks cut their regular programming. Screens across America lit up with the scene. Crockett seated firmly, calm amid the storm, and Warren, the veteran warrior, sitting beside her as if passing an invisible torch. Pundits scrambled for explanations. Was this the birth of a new movement? A crack in the foundation of congressional power? Or a momentary spectacle soon to be buried under the weight of Washington's inertia? Behind closed doors, however, the mood was far darker. In private strategy rooms, senior lawmakers seethed. Crockett's words had not only embarrassed them on live television, they had exposed decades of their complicity. Lobbyists exchanged worried calls. Party operatives began drafting talking points, trying to decide whether to dismiss Crockett as an overzealous newcomer or to quietly neutralize her before her momentum grew. But outside the insulated halls of power, something else was happening. Clips of Crockett's testimony flooded social media. Her words, sharp, unflinching, defiant, were shared by millions within hours. College students posted them under hashtags demanding accountability. Legal scholars dissected her arguments, grudgingly admitting her precision. Grassroots organizations, tired of decades of political doublespeak, hailed her as a voice they had been waiting for. Elizabeth Warren, too, seemed changed by the encounter. She was no stranger to ideological battles, but aligning herself so openly with Crockett had been a gamble. Yet as she watched the firestorm unfold, she recognized something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Not just for policy wins, but for a revival of the constitutional spirit itself. For Warren, this wasn't just a debate partner, it was the beginning of a possible heir. Crockett, however, knew the price of defiance. She had felt it before in courtrooms where opposing counsel bent rules, where judges ignored fairness, where the system seemed rigged to crush those who dared to resist. Washington, she realized, would be no different. The moment she stepped out of that chamber, she wasn't just a representative anymore, she was a target. The backlash came quickly. Editorials in establishment papers called her reckless. Anonymous leaks suggested she was grandstanding for cameras. Political allies quietly distanced themselves, unwilling to share the heat. Even within her own party, whispers grew louder: she's too radical, too outspoken, too dangerous. But Crockett didn't retreat. Instead, she doubled down. Invitations poured in, from universities, from civic forums, from town halls across the country. At Harvard Law, the very birthplace of Warren's intellectual battles, Crockett stood before a packed auditorium. The applause was thunderous, the questions pointed, the admiration undeniable. She wasn't just echoing Warren's fire, she was forging her own. Back in Washington, the old guard watched with mounting unease. One senator muttered to another in a closed-door meeting, "If we let her rise unchecked, she'll change the narrative. And if Warren keeps backing her, it won't just be rhetoric. It'll be a movement." A movement. That word, once dismissed, now haunted them. Because Washington feared nothing more than an idea whose time had come, and Jasmine Crockett was becoming more than just a freshman representative. She was becoming a symbol. And symbols, once born, are very hard to kill.